The story starts with chaos inside Iran itself. In late December 2025, widespread protests began erupting across the country, fueled by skyrocketing inflation, a collapsing rial, and years of economic mismanagement under sanctions. According to Amnesty International reports, these demonstrations quickly spread to major cities like Tehran, Mashhad, and Isfahan, drawing millions into the streets demanding everything from affordable food to an end to the regime's grip on power. But why now? Zoom out for a second. The rial hit a record low of around 1.34 million to the dollar, as the Telegraph noted, making basics like meat and dairy vanish from tables and pushing families to the brink. Imagine a shopkeeper in Tehran's Grand Bazaar shuttering his stall in solidarity, only to face riot squads firing live rounds. That's the scene that unfolded as protests intensified around January 3rd, with the regime's response turning lethal by January 8th. The New York Times detailed how security forces, including the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, unleashed a brutal crackdown amid a near-total communications blackout, killing thousands in just 2 days. Iran International's review of internal documents puts the death toll from January 8th and 9th alone at over 36,500, marking it as the deadliest 2-day protest massacre in history. Other estimates vary, like Al Jazeera's report of at least 3,117 confirmed deaths from state media, or the National Council of Resistance of Iran's figure of over 5,000 amid the blackout. Here's a quick reversal. What began as economic strikes in places like Qom, a regime stronghold, morphed into chants for regime overthrow, with crowds waving lion and sun flags and calling Javed Shah for a return to monarchy, as posts from users like Sohail captured on X. The OHCHR highlighted how thousands, including children, fell to live ammunition, with witnesses describing bodies piled in hospitals and snipers on rooftops, all while the internet shutdown, lasting over 48 hours in some areas, hid the scale from the world. CNN's accounts from inside paint a picture of enforced disappearances and torture, with the Norway-based Iran Human Rights Group estimating mass arrests topping 24,000. Think of a young student in Zahedan dodging tear gas and bullets, her video leaking out despite the blackout, showing regime forces destroying CCTV cameras to erase evidence, as BBC Verified documented in verified footage. This violence didn't just shock globally, it amplified fears of instability, with Supreme Leader Khamenei admitting several thousand deaths, per reports from The Guardian and others, while protesters persisted into late January. The Institute for the Study of War noted Iranian officials leaking details of the brutality to Western media, underscoring internal fractures. And economically, the World Bank projects Iran's GDP contracting by 2.3% this year, with inflation above 40% per IMF estimates, turning discontent into a full-blown crisis. This sets the stage for the deterrence dialogue loop, where U.S. moves like carrier deployments respond to the bloodshed, balancing force with faint hopes of talks. Now, shift to the seas. In direct response to Iran's brutal crackdown, the U.S. Navy dispatched the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, a formidable formation that includes the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier itself, at least one guided missile cruiser like the USS Mobile Bay, and several Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, such as the USS Spruance and USS Stockdale, as outlined in USNI news reports. This group, known as Carrier Strike Group 3, carries over 5,000 sailors and airmen, plus an air wing of more than 70 aircraft, including FA-18 Super Hornets for strike missions and E-2 Hawkeyes for airborne early warning, according to U.S. Navy fact sheets. Reuters confirmed the strike group entered the Middle East region on January 26th, positioning itself in the Indian Ocean under U.S. Central Command's area of responsibility, rather than the more provocative Arabian Sea bordering Iran. This marks the third time in recent years that the Lincoln's Group has been redirected from an Indo-Pacific deployment to the Middle East due to regional instability, as Forbes detailed in its coverage. Here's a quick analogy. Like a mobile airbase the size of a small city steaming into position, this deployment projects power without boots on the ground, capable of launching hundreds of sorties a day if needed. But let's zoom out. Why redirect now? The move bolsters U.S. options amid fears that Iran's internal chaos could spill over into proxy attacks on shipping lanes or U.S. allies, with CNN sources noting it's to assist in potential operations while tensions simmer. And the markets reacted swiftly. Oil prices surged nearly 3% right after the announcement, pushing Brent crude to around $66 per barrel and West Texas Intermediate to $61, as nation Thailand reported amid concerns over supply disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz. Picture the scene on the Lincoln's Bridge, where Captain Amy Bauernschmidt, the first woman to command a U.S. aircraft carrier, oversees flight ops as the ship cuts through choppy waters, her team monitoring Iranian naval movements via radar sweeps, all while back in Washington. Pentagon briefings emphasize this as a stabilizing presence, per Washington Post insights. Does this signal imminent conflict? Not necessarily. Defense Department assessments frame it as deterrence, echoing past deployments that cooled escalations without firing a shot. This military posture feeds directly into the deterrence dialogue loop, where visible strength like this carrier group creates leverage, pressuring Iran toward the negotiating table without immediate aggression. Yet, even as the Armada advances, Washington isn't slamming doors. On the same day the carrier's arrival made headlines, a senior U.S. official told reporters that Washington is open for business if Iran wishes to contact America, as Al Arabiya reported, emphasizing that the door remains ajar provided Tehran approaches on mutually agreed terms. This came straight from a briefing where the official added that the two sides know the conditions well, hinting at curbs on nuclear activities and regional proxies in exchange for sanctions relief. But what does open for business really mean here? It's not a blank check. Reuters captured the nuance, noting the U.S. stance requires Iran to initiate contact while acknowledging the ongoing flux in tensions. President Trump echoed this in an Axios interview, stating Iran wants to talk and make a deal, especially after the big Armada's deployment, which he described as putting pressure without immediate use. The Times of Israel highlighted Trump's view that the situation is in flux, blending military posture with a nod toward diplomacy. Zoom out to the broader signals. This isn't isolated rhetoric. Anadolu Ajansi noted Iranian envoys confirming ongoing message exchanges with the U.S., though stopping short of full negotiations, while insisting no talks under duress. Yet U.S. officials maintain conditional openness, as seen in State Department alerts urging Americans to leave Iran amid unrest, per Instagram updates from reliable sources. Iran's response? State media via Al Jazeera reported Tehran bracing for potential attacks, but signaling preparedness for war alongside openness to dialogue if pressure eases. Here's a micro-story. Imagine a back-channel diplomat in Oman, a traditional mediator, relaying Trump's words to Iranian counterparts over encrypted lines as tensions spike with the carrier nearby, captured in CNN's coverage of the standoff entering a dangerous phase. This duality feeds the deterrence dialogue loop, where the Armada's presence isn't just a threat, it's leverage to pull Iran toward the table, per Caspian Post analysis of the deployment's timing. Quick analogy, like a negotiator holding a strong hand in poker, the U.S. shows its cards through deployments while bluffing just enough to invite bets on peace. But does this mixed approach echo past patterns? History offers some telling lessons. Flashback to 1953, when the CIA orchestrated a coup that ousted Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, reinstalling Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. as detailed in declassified documents from the U.S. State Department. This move, driven by fears over oil nationalization, sowed seeds of resentment that echoed for decades, with Iran's oil revenues at the time accounting for over half its budget, per historical analyses from the Council on Foreign Relations. Zoom out to the broader fallout. By the 1970s, the Shah's regime, bolstered by U.S. arms sales totaling billions, faced growing domestic unrest amid economic inequality, where oil wealth enriched elites, while inflation eroded wages for ordinary Iranians, as Brookings Institution reports on the revolution's precursors highlight. Then came the pivotal reversal in 1979. The Islamic Revolution toppled the Shah, severing formal U.S.-Iran ties, and militants seized the American embassy in Tehran, holding 52 hostages for 444 days, according to PBS News timelines. Picture U.S. diplomats blindfolded in the embassy compound, their ordeal broadcast worldwide, fueling a cycle of sanctions that began immediately, with President Carter freezing Iranian assets worth $12 billion, as Wikipedia's historical account notes. Fast forward through the 80s, during the Iran-Iraq War, the U.S. tilted toward Baghdad, providing intelligence and economic aid, while the Iran-Contra affair secretly funneled arms to Tehran, exposing contradictions in policy, per congressional investigations. Here's a quick analogy. Like two boxers trading jabs in a ring they can't escape, these events locked both nations into the deterrence dialogue loop, where military posturing alternated with fleeting overtures. In 2002, President Bush labeled Iran part of the axis of evil, escalating sanctions that halved Iran's GDP growth in the following decade, World Bank data shows. But diplomacy flickered in 2015 with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, where Iran curbed its nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief, boosting its oil exports from 1.1 million to over 2.5 million barrels per day by 2016, according to U.S. Energy Information Administration figures. That thaw didn't last. In 2018, President Trump withdrew from the deal, reimposing maximum pressure sanctions that shrank Iran's economy by 7.6% in 2019 alone, IMF estimates indicate. Tensions peaked in 2020 with the U.S. drone strike killing General Qasem Soleimani, prompting Iranian missile strikes on U.S. bases in Iraq, as Al Jazeera's timeline recounts, injuring over 100 troops but avoiding full war. These cycles reveal how the deterrence dialogue loop has trapped both nations. Strength invites talks, but mistrust perpetuates standoffs. Fast forward to today, and Iran's nuclear program has advanced, with the International Atomic Energy Agency reporting uranium enrichment at 60% purity, just shy of weapons-grade levels. But here's the surprising pivot, reframing everything we've discussed. The real story isn't the protests or even the nuclear shadow. It's Iran's crumbling economy forcing hands on both sides. Hammered by years of U.S. sanctions, Iran's economy is buckling under pressures that make dialogue not just an option, but a necessity for survival. The World Bank projected in October 2025 that Iran's GDP would contract in both 2025 and 2026 due to tighter sanctions and falling oil revenues, potentially shrinking by up to 2% amid global demand slowdowns. Yet the International Monetary Fund offers a slightly rosier view, forecasting a modest 1.1% growth for 2026, though still far below pre-sanctions levels when annual expansion averaged over 4%. But let's ask, how does this hit everyday Iranians? Inflation remains stubbornly high, with the IMF estimating consumer prices rose 42.4% in 2025 and won't dip below 40% in 2026, eroding purchasing power and fueling the very protests we've discussed. Wikipedia's account of the crisis notes peaks above 48% in late 2025, making staples like bread and fuel unaffordable for millions. Zoom out to the oil lifeline. Sanctions have slashed exports, with Anadolu Ajansi reporting a 16% drop in total exports to around $100 billion for 2025, including a sharp decline in non-oil goods as global partners pull back. Reuters highlights how this crisis turns Iran into an oil swing factor, with potential supply disruptions from unrest threatening global markets already volatile from 2025's conflicts. Government debt is climbing too, projected to reach 36.4% of GDP in 2026 per Salam Gateway analysis, up from lower levels before the latest sanction waves. Here's a quick reversal. While hardliners blame external forces, internal mismanagement amplifies the pain, with Statista charting real GDP growth plummeting to just 0.6% in 2025 amid 40% inflation. Micro story time. Envision a Tehran factory worker watching his wages halve in real terms over 2 years, as Iran International describes prolonged economic exhaustion after military setbacks, pushing families to ration meals and skip medical care. This isn't sustainable. The deterrence dialogue loop thrives here, as U.S. pressure through sanctions and deployments corners Iran economically, making conditional talks a potential escape valve. Deutsche Welle notes that entering 2026, protests and sanctions form a vicious cycle, with no quick relief in sight without diplomatic breakthroughs. And this economic squeeze doesn't stop at borders. It ripples outward. In the Middle East, this standoff isn't contained to just U.S.-Iran exchanges. It draws in allies and adversaries alike, heightening risks across the region. Israel, for instance, remains on high alert, with the Jerusalem Post reporting Trump's warnings on Iran's nuclear ambitions as a direct threat, prompting Israeli officials to bolster defenses amid fears of proxy attacks from Hezbollah in Lebanon. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, key U.S. partners, express mixed views. Reuters notes the UAE's opposition to escalation, citing potential disruptions to Gulf shipping lanes that carry 20% of global oil per Energy Information Administration data. Zoom out globally. The deployment amplifies concerns at the United Nations, where Anadolu Agency captured the UN's voiced worries over rising military tensions, urging de-escalation to avoid broader conflict. Oil markets feel the pinch immediately, with prices volatile. Brent crude hovered around $66 per barrel post-deployment, as CNN sources linked to fears of Strait of Hormuz closures that could slash global supply by 15%, according to International Energy Agency estimates. Here's a quick analogy. Like a chessboard where one pawn's move threatens the king, this carrier presence deters Iranian aggression in Yemen or Iraq, but risks pulling in Russia or China, who Al Jazeera reports are watching U.S. naval shifts closely amid their own regional investments. Micro story time. Envision a Yemeni fisherman in the Red Sea spotting U.S. warships on the horizon, his livelihood threatened by potential Houthi retaliations that have already disrupted 10% of global trade routes, as World Shipping Council figures show. The deterrence dialogue loop plays out here on a grand scale, stabilizing short-term threats while inviting long-term diplomatic resets, but it also strains alliances. For example, European nations like France push for talks, per Desiree News coverage, to avert energy crises hitting their economies. Of course, not everyone buys this approach. Now let's address the strongest counter-argument head-on. Critics argue this carrier deployment is reckless saber-rattling that unnecessarily escalates tensions, potentially drawing the U.S. into an accidental conflict in the crowded Gulf waters. The war zone reports highlight risks from Iranian drone swarms and hypersonic missiles, with experts warning the Abraham Lincoln could face credible threats amid Tehran's vows of total war if struck. Fair point, but history rebuts it calmly. Similar U.S. naval buildups in 2019 and 2020 deterred Iranian aggression on shipping without sparking broader war, as Rand Corporation analyses show, actually stabilizing volatile oil routes through measured presence rather than provocation. Here's a quick reversal. What seems like escalation might actually buy time, with Global Times noting the carrier's position outside striking distance of Iran, signaling deterrence over imminent attack. Now, the second strong critique. The U.S. signals of openness to talks are just empty rhetoric or a bluff, masking preparations for strikes without real diplomatic intent, given past breakdowns like the 2018 JCPOA withdrawal. Yet evidence counters this steadily. Trump has pulled back from the brink multiple times, as CNN reports, framing interventions in humanitarian terms while holding off on strikes to avoid long-term commitments. Iran International adds that Tehran's combative statements reflect taking U.S. deployments seriously, opening subtle channels despite the buildup. Micro-story time. Think of White House aides debating late-night options, opting for warnings over action, as The Guardian details Trump's public threats tempered by restraint. This duality reinforces the deterrence dialogue loop, turning critics' fears into calculated balance. As we wrap this chain of cause, mechanism, and consequence, consider the paths ahead. In the best-case scenario, conditional talks gain traction, leading to a revamped nuclear deal that eases sanctions and stabilizes Iran's economy, potentially boosting GDP growth to 3.5% by 2027, as IMF models based on past relief periods suggest. The base case unfolds as a tense stalemate, with the carrier group maintaining deterrence while sporadic back-channel messages prevent outright conflict, keeping oil prices anchored around $65 per barrel amid balanced supply, per International Energy Agency forecasts. Worst case? A miscalculation, like an Iranian proxy strike on U.S. assets, spirals into limited military exchanges, disrupting the Strait of Hormuz and cutting global oil flows by up to 20%, as U.S. Geological Survey risk assessments warn, triggering a recessionary spike in energy costs worldwide. Zoom out for a moment. These paths hinge on the deterrence dialogue loop's fragile balance, where one side's restraint could unlock de-escalation or fuel breakdown. Watch for early warning indicators to spot shifts early. Sudden oil price jumps above $70, tracked by Bloomberg terminals, or heightened Iranian rhetoric in state media like Press TV, signaling hardening stances. Other signs include unusual proxy movements in Syria or Iraq, as monitored by Institute for the Study of War reports, or abrupt U.S. troop surges in the region per Pentagon announcements, all tipping the loop toward either resolution or rupture. Thanks for investing time with us in this deep dive. Your time means a lot as we unpack these complex geopolitics. If you value evidence-led analysis like this, hit subscribe to catch our next breakdown on emerging global hotspots. Drop a comment below. What do you think is the biggest risk in U.S.-Iran relations right now? And for our next topic, how about exploring China's quiet moves in the South China Sea?